Live now to discuss all of this breakdown is Simon Jackman, CEO of the United States Studies Centre. Simon, thank you for your time. Now, what do you think is the next step for Joe Biden? Does he have any chance now to pull ahead?
Very, very difficult at this point. South Carolina is his one shot to demonstrate that he does enjoy the support of the African-American vote in the Democratic base. The polls there suggest that that race has been tightening up, a 5-point gap in the last poll I saw out of South Carolina between him and Bernie Sanders. But it's looking, if the national polls and that strength that Sanders showed in Nevada, look, if that holds up through to Super Tuesday, increasingly I think we have to be considering the very real prospect that Sanders does run away with this and indeed locks it up, possibly by the middle of March, again, if those numbers hold up. And so that's why so much turns on Biden's showing in South Carolina.
And we saw last time it was Nevada where Hillary Clinton pulled ahead of Bernie Sanders, and so now he's solidified his lead. But is there still concern that he could be too much of an extreme candidate? Is there still any appetite, do you think, for a middle-of-the-road candidate like Pete Buttigieg, like Amy Klobuchar?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely there is. And this is the thing to keep in mind. As impressive as that Nevada result is, about 40% of the vote, it's still not 50%. And, and that's the thing to take away from all this, from the actual results we're seeing in Nevada, but also the polling data, that more than 50% prefer someone else other than Sanders. 16, it was essentially a two-horse race, Sanders and Clinton. The field remains diverse in terms of the number of candidates contesting the Democratic nomination. And so this is why, does Sanders just keep pulling far enough ahead that he gets to the convention with the nomination sewn up with the majority, or does he just fall short, doesn't have a majority of delegates come the convention in Milwaukee, at which point there's some serious choices to be made among the other candidates. Do they throw their lot in with Sanders, who looks like he will get to Milwaukee with the most delegates, or do they bind together and do a deal and put forward a nominee to stop Sanders, as it were, precisely motivated by this fear, a very real one, I think, that he is just too far to the left to be competitive against Donald Trump in November.
The other interesting story here is Michael Bloomberg. Now, we know he hasn't really entered the race, but he has. He's been part of the polling that got him onto the debate stage, but it wasn't included in this Nevada vote. He's waiting for Super Tuesday. Is he still the threat he once was? Look,
it's difficult to say, because that debate ahead of the Nevada caucus, where everybody just blasted away at him, and Elizabeth Warren in particular, how much damage that did to Bloomberg, and we're keeping a very close eye on some polls that are coming out. We're not going to get a real test until Super Tuesday itself, but he is, his whole strategy has been, I'm the go-to candidate if you need someone to come in and to be the moderate alternative to Sanders, because it does look like Biden, who is presumed to be that candidate, just is not getting traction with the Democratic base, our earlier conversation about South Carolina notwithstanding. So that is the Bloomberg strategy. Whether it's too little too late, that the Sanders juggernaut is just it's not going to matter. And indeed, does Sanders rack up, or is on track, solid track, to have a majority of the delegates, then this Bloomberg strategy won't matter. What is interesting and what makes Bloomberg relevant is what happens on Super Tuesday and perhaps the next contest after that. Does it look like we're going to Milwaukee without a majority of delegates for Sanders? Or are we in a world where there's still that game to be played, and in which case Bloomberg is essentially buying himself a big seat at that table of horse trading in a possible stop Sanders game that might get played between now and Milwaukee?
And if we're talking about how critical the black vote's been in these Democratic races, if we're talking about lack of support from black voters, we know Pete Buttigieg is really weak on that point. We saw Hillary Clinton's support collapse there because of her support of Bill Clinton's 3 strikes rule. So when you've got this stop and frisk policy so closely attached to Mike Bloomberg, surely that's going to be a real weak point going into these the rest of the caucuses, the primaries?
Yeah, exactly. And it was one of the things he was at great pains to try and put behind him. But then also, and just as he may have thought he'd done some work on that, Elizabeth Warren hits him with this about the NDAs he signed with former female employees of his companies and whatnot. So there's a lot of work for Bloomberg to position himself and to make himself, if you will, palatable to the base of voters that are showing up and voting in these Democratic primaries and caucuses. And so that's the big question mark over him. But very quickly, this will take on sort of a different character, and that is there'll be this real moment of truth, and we may already be there in the United States, and that is Sanders the party's best shot, best realistic shot to take on Donald Trump in the general? What are we focused on? A candidate we like, is consummate with our values and all the rest of it, or a candidate who can beat Donald Trump? And right now, the conversation is, oh my God, is Sanders that candidate? And maybe that conversation, it's too late. He's already got it. And now we have to rally behind Sanders. Or is there still daylight open to us, us being the Democratic voters and strategists, to put forward a Bloomberg, to put forward someone else, and the party will just have to hold its nose on whatever they may think about that candidate for other reasons and stay focused on that main game in November. And that's the conversations happening in real time in the United States right now.
Certainly, very interesting field of play. Simon Jackman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.